Welcome to the Tony Kinnett cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated first on 93 WIBC. When you're looking at historians in the United States, you can essentially go one of two directions. You can go towards someone who emotionalizes history, who makes history kind of about them and kind of bends it to whatever way that they prefer. Or you can choose a historian who is very passionate about the history, its preservation, and its communication, learning from the actual data points on the board. There are a few guys who hold to that side of genuine history keeping than Bob Woodson. Of course, he's the founder and president of the Woodson Center. He is, I would argue, one of the men who continue to champion true civil rights in this country. Mr. Woodson, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure, always.
Well, there's a lot that we can discuss. The media is currently whipping up a firestorm about the administration versus different universities and diversity, equity, and inclusion style policies, everywhere from Harvard to UCLA, which are currently being sued for alleged racial bias in admissions to its medical school. Asian demographically, 41% of the total applicants, but only 30% of the matriculants. So I know that you've written in detail about how affirmative action can, in some cases, be, and not a play on words here, a life or death matter. Can you talk about this a little bit with us?
Yeah, as a veteran of the civil rights movement, I led demonstrations in the 60s, and I left the civil rights movement on the issue of affirmative action. I found it to be a bait and switch game where we use the demographics of one group of blacks as the bait, and the switch comes when the money and the resources come. And there was a time that, like Dr. King said, we were really talking about an opportunity to achieve. We weren't looking for any special treatment. But the civil rights movement, unfortunately, the leadership morphed into a grievance industry, and they began to define blacks as, in other words, the greatest defense against oppression is to achieve. And so civil rights leaders became political leaders in the cities, aided by the federal government coming in with the poverty programs and $22 trillion spent that created a commodity out of poor people. And so in order to keep the funds flowing, they had to define blacks as a victim class. And so a lot of money has been spent and is really dumbed down. In fact, the challenge we face today is worse than we did in the 60s against the Klan. The soft bigotry of low expectation is much more insidious and detrimental to the lives of blacks than anything coming from outside, from racist.
Well, and more permanent. And when you look at the amount of scorn that is behind every kind, I put with all of the quotes in the world, because it's not real kindness, but this kind of faux kindness that tries to tut-tut, that talks down to members of the black communities in this country as though they were animals that desperately needed care because they were too stupid to do things on their own. Like you said, the terrifying idea that perhaps black people in the United States might have their own emotion and drive to achieve and no longer need the kind, again, with quotes around it, handouts of some suburban lady who needed a social cause more than she actually needed to see justice or improvement. That is something that has generational impact because it directly affects the hearts and the minds of young black Americans who are told constantly, you could never survive without my handouts. Exactly. I can't think of something so demoralizing.
We really are sending a dangerous message to all of our children. America doesn't have a race problem. It has a grace problem.
Preach.
Because there's a moral and spiritual freefall as they're consuming children against across race and class lines. The leading cause of death for teenagers in Silicon Valley is suicide, 6 times the national average. And Appalachia is prescription drugs and homicide in the inner city. If you keep bombarding children with the proposition that they live in a country that hates them, either because they are a villain or a victim, after a while, children will begin to believe that perhaps they are themselves unworthy. And that's why they are being so labeled. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone that it undermines the character and desire, and it erodes self-confidence. So you devalue life. If you devalue life, you'll take your own or take someone else's. It's different sides of the same coin.
This is why encouraging opportunity and encouraging self-motivation and drive with, again, as you pointed out, grace and with that, I think true human charity, not corporate or tax-funded charity, is such a key aspect of lifting kids. It's such a key aspect of lifting kids out of this dark mire, because once you have purpose, that you're driven to achieve something that you set your sights on, that puts a lot of the risk of drug abuse, of suicide, of being in situations where you might you might feel the need to participate in fights that lead up to homicide, things of that nature. Those are put to the side because there is the singular purpose in the pursuit of goals, the Abrahamic dream, the idea to go into a foreign land and to seek and to grow and to walk with God and to be a better man or woman. That's something that this country traded in exchange for the soft-handed fake do-goodiness of taxing people to, in this like weird claim to rectify perceived unfixable racial gaps.
Right. But also, part of the race grievance industry, they present problems for which there are no solutions. Booker T. Washington wrote in Up From Slavery that there is a class of Negroes who thrive off of the grievance of their people. If Black America lose their grievance, they lose their income.
Well, when I was a teacher and an administrator at Indianapolis Public Schools, I was with a pack of teachers and administrators observing other teachers, and actually, of all places, Crispus Attucks High School. I'll never forget watching an English teacher, this 35, 36-year-old white English teacher, deride Booker T. Washington to his class, all but called him an uncle. It was disgusting to watch and observe, all because he had a realistic perspective of the pursuit of opportunity and achieving something far beyond kind of an internal grievance structure, as you've talked about.
Well, one of the things we did at the Woodson Center in documenting what the reality was, but when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. There were 5 high schools at the turn of the century in New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and New Orleans. They had used textbooks, overcrowded buildings, half the budgets of white schools. Every one of those black schools out-tested every white school in those respective cities. In between 1920 and 1940, in the South, blacks closed the education gap from 3 years to 6 months because of the 5,000 Rosenwald Booker T schools that were established. So the question is, if blacks could close the education gap between 1920 and 1940, when racism was enshrined in law, we had no political representation, half the budgets, used textbooks, why are we failing today?
I have to cut in just momentarily here and point out that as an education, as a historical statistic, a series of statistics, because you talked about the 5 high schools in several key cities, it is so discordant to the narrative that is being constantly pushed. I sat under the instruction of Gloria Ladson Billings. I audited a few of her courses in Wisconsin when she was claiming that critical race theory was needed instead of a focus on the family. Critical race theory was needed in order to solve kind of the learning gaps in the 80s and the 90s from Black communities in the United States. And she would have never, ever admitted to a case where a striving for excellence is far more worthwhile than just claiming that this destitute group of people needs lots of money. And the reason they're not succeeding is because, well, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough this. It's insane how quickly true history, real definable statistics, things that we could see and observe still today, are cast aside because, well, that doesn't fit the narrative.
Exactly, but that's why there's an attack on truth, but also I think it was Chuck Swindoll who said that not 10% of who we are is our external challenges, racism, how we were raised, the abuse. 90% of who we are is the attitude about the 10%. And so a lot of people who are part of the grace grievance industries are what I call crucifixionists.
Crucifixionists.
They only look at the crucifixion. There were thousands of people crucified before Christ and after him, but there was only one resurrection. And so we look at the true story is not just the crucifixion, it's the resurrection. That's what makes it a story. And so you can choose to focus on resurrection and define yourself and your country that way. Slavery was America's birth defect, but none of us should be defined by the worst of what we used to be.
I mean, you look at a lot of the art that came out of the 20th century that was focused on achievement, and still some of the statues that stand in universities, not just historically Black colleges and universities, but universities and institutions all over the country, of men and women of perseverance, who were celebrated because they achieved things that were by the sweat of their brow, by the grace of God, by the brilliance that they cultivated. Whereas now we're seeing a weird series of statues that are appearing to celebrate the fact that a person is Black, like in New York Times, or some other trivial things that don't inspire. They condemn and create such a culture of, like you said, focusing on a crucifixion that, by the way, those same people that are depicted in these statues were never subject to.
No. It really doesn't. It's like I said, that I was stationed in the South in the 50s. I know what racism looks like, but at least the enemy was external. The worst thing that could be visited upon Black America today is white guilt. Because to me, white guilt is the substance of white superiority. How you believe that you have the capacity to deliver people from of themselves, from themselves. That is white supremacy.
As though that if I lived my life without spending every single second of the day apologizing and kind of bowing over and giving a demographic money and special placement, that if I did not do those things, then every Black American would be doomed to failure. It is such a disgusting, horridly insulting idea that your entire life is not bound by your own decisions, not your family, not your character, but by some other random person, and whether or not they deem to stoop low to give you the crumbs from their table. It blows my mind how there isn't a greater conversation, especially in the realms of arts and innovation, about the crippling that we're actively doing still to entire groups of, like you pointed out, quite well framed children, especially.
Yeah, it really is, and so that's why at the Woodson Center we have as our base 3,000 low income grassroots leaders of all different racial groups in 39 states. And there are different racial and ethnic groups. In the 44 years we've been in existence, we've had retreats, and racism, race animus never came up in any of our gatherings. Because when people are confronted with true brokenness in their lives, true challenges of drugs, and their only concern is what is the pathway towards redemption.
And amazing how yelling and blaming and castigation never seems to be the genuine solution to those problems.
No, and this is why I had a debate with Hawk Newman, the head of Black Lives Matter, on and said what I kept confronting him with. I think we confront that experience will always trump an argument, and a witness is more powerful than an advocate.
Hang on, are you suggesting that the historian brings historical data that's reliable? My goodness, what a concept! I can't believe it.
But it always stops him, even the most ardent opponent of what I'm saying. See, you can confront my arguments all day, but you have to confront my facts. And so what I said to him, if we were able in 1930 to 1940, when the unemployment rate in America for whites was 25%, it was 40%, Black had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. Elderly people could walk safely without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. Never heard of a child shot in their cribs. So being deprived never makes you depraved.
I tell you what, I always forget until you and I get into a conversation how much I start to lean into it. I tell you what, you have me looking forward to church on Sunday. Man, last question here. Tell us about the curriculum over at the Woodson Center. That wasn't why we set this one up. You and I talked about it very briefly before we started this interview. Tell us a little bit about it so that I can push people over to
when
it
Nicole
later.
Hannah-Jones published the 1619, what we did at the Woodson Center was we responded not by offering a counter argument, but a narrative. So we put together 23 Black scholars, and we went and took a deep dive into the history of Black America, how we achieved against the odds. And it's called Red, White, and Black. Rescuing America from Revisionist History and Race Hustlers. It's sold out in 3 weeks. A book of essays sold out in 3 weeks. And we developed curriculum from it in the past 3 years. It's been downloaded 500,000 times. We have 7 animations for children showing them how people achieved against the odds. A 7-minute animation. They are 700,000 downloads. So Americans are thirsty for the truth, and they're looking for an aspirational and an inspirational narrative that comes from that truth.
Well, the stuff that always works to inspire? No way. I can't believe inspirational stuff inspires. Yet again, shocked.
Yes, sir. So we have a sequel called Pathways to American Renewal. And these are all available on Amazon, or you can get the Woodson Center, woodsоncenter.org, and we'll be delighted to. But all 50 states, even in the People's Republic of Oregon, they've downloaded.
Bob Woodson, it is such a pleasure to get to chat with you again. And really, I will, of course, link all of these down in the description. Go check out the curriculum. You need to read these essays. The reason they have been sold out in the past is when mama puts good food on the table, the good food is what goes first. So, look, take a little of advice, get some of the good stuff. Again, Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this special episode of the Tony Kinnett Cast on the weekend with Bob Woodson. We'll be back Monday with a whole lot more. I'm Tony Kinnett, and this has been the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC. Take care.